before starting the installation and configuration, let us understand what are the hardware requirements for the Arista Next Generation Firewall. Whether you are setting up NG firewall on dedicated hardware or virtual environments or even custom built systems, understanding the hardware requirements ensures optimal performance, scalability, and security for your network. Arista NG Firewall is a powerful, flexible, software-based firewall. However, like any robust software, it performs best when deployed on compatible and adequately resourced hardware. Fail to meet these recommended specs can lead to slower network performance, increased latency, potentially security vulnerabilities due to processing delays. So let's break down what you will need. NG Firewall must be installed on a dedicated system. It cannot run alongside other operating systems. So you will need minimum 2 network cards or NICs, one for the internal network called LAN and one for the external network called WAN. Of course, you can have more depending upon how many networks you are operating into. Then you will be installing it on the hard drive. You have 2 main options for the deployment of NG firewalls. Purchase an NG firewall appliance or using your own hardware. Arista offers dedicated NG firewall appliances that come pre-installed with software. These are optimized for the performance and security. They feature zero-touch deployment via ETM dashboard, making them easily to manage remotely. Appliances like Z4, Z12, and Z20 are designed to handle different network sizes, from small offices to large enterprises. And option 2 is using your own hardware. If you prefer flexibility, NG Firewall can be installed on your own desktop or server hardware. This approach allows you to repurpose existing equipment and customize performance based on your network demands. You can save the cost compared to buying new hardware. But you will need to ensure that the hardware meets the specific needs. So let us talk about the recommended hardware by the network size. Here is a helpful guide for selecting hardware based on number of devices in your network. So if you just want to have Untangle Firewall installed, you need to have minimum 1 core CPU, 2 GB of the RAM, and 40 GB of the hard disk. And if you want to have 1 to 50 devices with apps, you need to have 2 core CPU minimum, 4 GB of RAM, 40 GB of the hard disk. And equivalent hardware is Z4. If you have 50 to 150 devices, you will need to have 4 core CPU, 8 GB RAM, and 80 GB minimum hard disk. So if you're having 151 to 500 devices, you will need 4 plus cores of the CPU, 16 GB of the RAM, 160 GB of the hard disk. And if you're having 501 to 1500 devices, you will need 4 plus core CPUs, 16 GB of RAM, and 250 GB of the hard disk. And if you have between 1500 to 5000 devices, you will need at least 6 cores of the CPU, 32 GB of the RAM, and 500 GB of minimum hard disk. Arista ATM Z20 or Q20 are the options for that. Of course, if there are more devices, so you can accordingly choose your hardware. Keep in mind that these are just the guidelines. These are not a strict rule. So each network environment is unique. Depending upon the traffic, load, active apps, and user behavior, you will need to choose the hardware accordingly. Now let's talk about compatibility. NG Firewall is based on Linux. So if your hardware runs Linux smoothly, there is a good chance that NG Firewall will work smoothly. Key components to include is the network interface cards. Ensure that they are Linux compatible. So you will need to make some changes or some adjustments into BIOS configuration that can resolve the hardware compatibility. So you must go with the configuration and you must check that. When you're choosing hard disk, I will highly recommend you to go for SSD because SSD will make faster performance, especially in the larger network. Of course, you will need to have a faster performance of the operating system. If you're unsure about the hardware compatibility, install NG Firewall on the target hardware. If it doesn't work, try tweaking BIOS settings, swap out the components like network interface cards or drives. If it still fails, the hardware may simply be incompatible. Before we wrap up, here are the key points to remember. NG Firewall requires dedicated hardware with at least 2 network interface cards. You can deploy it on Arista appliance or on your own hardware. So match your hardware to your network size to ensure optimal performance. Test for the compatibility when you are using custom built systems. So here is an assignment for you. Assess your current hardware and see if it meets the NG Firewall's requirement. If you are planning to build or repurpose hardware, list the specs, and identify any potential compatibility concerns. In the next lecture, we'll cover the installation process and initial configurations. Leave your questions and feedback so that I can help you better in guiding to start with the next generation firewall.